6. Forethought and careful planning allied to a knowledge of the protagonists will usually result in a clear pattern. But there are always pitfalls. The books of Carwin, to most men on that world, Carwin was an unknown, and therefore frightening, entity. What little knowledge of the place existed was mostly limited to vague rumors and expressed doubts. It was an island located roughly at the center of the world Heart Sea. Few men had seen it, for the place was shrouded in near impenetrable mist. And those few who had, refused to speak of it. Rumor told of man-like creatures possessed of unguessable powers, sorcerers, following some weird, inhuman religion. They could, it was said, see both past and future, even shape the destiny of mankind. And even though the islanders seldom ventured into the outer world, they were held in awe and fear, and therefore hated by most lesser beings. Such doubts afflicted the 3 sailors manning the little fishing boat that Spellbinder used powers Raven had not previously seen. When one began to grumble, speaking of turning back, the dark-haired man moved to face him. Raven loosened her blade, prepared to use force if necessary to goad them on. But Spellbinder spoke softly, staring deep into the sailor's eyes, and the man relaxed, slowly at first, but then nodded as though agreeing with a wise teacher. Spellbinder moved his hands before the man's face, and in moments, he was back at his post. The black and silver warrior then went to each seaman in turn, still murmuring too soft for Raven to hear the words. His darting fingers weaving strange patterns in the air, seeming to leave a faint trace of brightness where they moved. And the seamen set to manning the boat with a cheerfulness that belied their earlier reservations. When Raven asked him what he had done, Spellbinder smiled, dismissing it. "They fear shadows," he said. "I simply persuaded them of their foolishness." He would not be drawn further, and when Raven attempted to press him, he changed the subject with an adroitness that led their conversation away into other channels before she realized what was happening. They sailed swiftly westwards, a benevolent wind filling the triangular sail until it cracked and strained against the central mast. There was little privacy on board, for the vessel was designed for swift trawlings of the coastal waters rather than ocean crossings, and the deck was open except for the canopy spread across the raised stern. There, Raven and Spellbinder slept, the hands occupying the boards of the deck. The narrow hold was designed for storing the catch, and its darkness was redolent of fish. Yet it was a trim vessel, lean prowed and clean to handle, responding eagerly to the stern-mounted tiller. For 7 days the wind blew fair, the sea remaining calm as a mill pond. The fishing boat skimmed over a surface of translucent blue, so still that they appeared to slide upon rather than cut through it. It was unnatural, and Raven wondered if Spellbinder had woven some magic to speed their passage. She resisted the temptation to ask him. He remained obdurately silent where such matters were concerned. Instead, Cher remained concentrated on enjoying the journey. Apart from the brief coastal voyage with Arger, she had never been in a boat before, and this silent traveling was a strange and wondrous experience. They had packed rations before embarking. The lines they dropped overboard yielded a rich haul of fish so that they ate well. Dewfall cups were mounted around the boat, and they had no shortage of water for drinking, wine from hold-stored flagons. It was, oddly, given the urgency of their mission, an idyll she came to enjoy. On the 9th day it changed. The sun rose gold and silver above the western edge of World Heart, and its rays struck bright beams of dazzling iridescence from the ripples shaking the sea. Raven watched them, entranced by the play of light upon the water. Then realized that she had never seen the ocean this way before. For 8 full days and nights it had remained still. Now it bled as a nervous animal trembles, sensing something amiss. She called Spellbinder to her side, pointing to the disturbance, and the warrior reached down to plunge a hand into the brine. For long moments he hung over the side of the boat, then grunted, coming upright. Ignoring Raven, he called for the seaman to reef in the sail to half its size, and took the steer-oar himself. He appeared caught in a reverie, his mouth moving swiftly to form unheard words, his eyes fixed upon some distant point beyond the far horizon. Gradually, the rippling increased, the gentle undulation of the sea growing fiercer. The ripples became small waves, streamers of foam flecking from the over-curves. The wind grew stronger, shifting around to blow from the north, turning the waves to strike the boat along its length, rather than from ahead. The azure sky shaded a darker blue, and that grew darker still, until it was the color of old armor, all fusty gray struck through with shades of black. Clouds formed, billowing huge and menacing until their darkness shut out the sun and darts of lightning played between them. Soon, the lightning was the only illumination, for the clouds seemed to billow across the lowering heavens until they shut out all other light, closing the ocean within a night-black curtain. Thunder bellowed sonorously across the sky, and the waves grew larger. Combers of foaming white, shimmering beneath the lightning, marked their edges, like teeth glinting in the jaws of a predatory beast. High as the boat, they rose, lashing the gunwales with a mounting, supernatural fury. The wind got up and whipped the sail, driving salt spray over the deck, blinding the occupants so that they stumbled to their duties, clutching hurriedly set ropes to keep their footing on the pitching deck. The wind became a banshee screech that lashed at them like a flail, seeking to tear them from their precarious holds and toss them to the ravening waves. The waves, too, appeared to seek them out, tongues of stinging salt spilling over the timbers, drenching them, smarting where they splashed over eyes and exposed skin. Cold was the water, and angry the ocean. The sky remained black, now a total blackness near as dark as the subterranean passage of the stone temple, so that the men fumbled over the deck, their only illumination the bolts of darting lightning. As the arrows of some angry god might be hurled at the earth, so struck that lightning. Now it was a great curtain of white fire that fell across the sky, lighting the roiling sea with a brilliance that threatened to sear the eyes, as though the core of the sun itself glared upon them. Now it became tongues of fire, lancing down in vivid, sharp-edged trails of searing fury. The sea boiled where it struck, great clouds of steam gusting upwards to the noise, some heavens. The stink of sulfur filled the air, the pungency adding to the discomfort of salt smart and wind whip. Now it became 1,000 balls of dancing fire, leaping from wave tip to wave tip, prancing over halyards and deck rails, sparking flame from soaking rope and wind-frayed sail. A ball leaped from the masthead towards a sailor as he stared with open, terror-struck mouth at the descending fireball. It engulfed him so that he stood, for a moment, with head and chest contained within the shimmering, blue-silver orb. His arms waved madly as a smell of singeing pervaded the deck. Then the odor was driven away by the howling wind, and the lightning spun off into the blackness. A great sheet of white fire spread across the sky, and the sailor stood exposed to the horrified gaze of his companions. His hair and shirt were gone, in their place black flesh from which sparkled tendrils of flame. His face was a screaming death mask, sightless holes where his eyes had been, the flesh burned and puckered. The wind whipped his screaming away, and he followed it over the side, plunging into the tumultuous sea. As he hit the water, a great hole appeared to open, as though the ocean gaped a mouth to suck him down. Raven saw him go, and turned to Spellbinder, yelling above the demonic, raving of thunder, wind, and water. Is this how Carwin defends itself? Do the ghost priests kill so glibly? No. Spellbinder's shout was anguished as her own. The mist hides them. That should be enough. I think we have, perhaps, sailed into some battle. He shouted something else, but the wind took his words away, and a wave, greater than the others, turned the boat so that Raven was forced to grasp the railing or be swept away to join the lightning-struck sailor. The vessel turned, the sheer force of the wave ripping the tiller from Spellbinder's grip. It spun stern on to the pounding sea. And as the warriors struggled to bring it back to face the fury of the waters, a great wave rose up behind them. A full mast higher than the boat, it was, a wall of roiling water that came at them like some angry sea beast, or some sea god's fist come to pluck them down into the depths. It rose black and sleek, its inner surface curving up to a crest that spilled steaming foam that glimmered white in the lightning. Shadows played over the inner face of the wave, and its foam was ripped onwards by the wind. High, it lifted, higher than the mast, then higher still, rushing down upon them as a mountain, shifted from its foundations in the earth, might rush down upon the unwary. Raven wrapped both her arms around the railing of the stern, saw Spellbinder lock his grip over the tiller. There was a great silence, as though the wave blocked out the screaming of the wind, the bellowing of the thunder, with its own awful majesty. Up and up, it rose, reaching high above the helpless vessel. Spray like a salt rain fell from its inner reaches. And there was a sibilation as of 1,000 snakes that rang from its black sheening sides. Then it curled and came down and struck. Raven felt a mighty blow smash her against the planking of the stern deck. The air was blasted from her lungs, and when she tried to breath, there was only water, salt and deadly, to fill her lungs. She briefly glimpsed Spellbinder, tumbling from the rudder, and then there was nothing but the roaring of stinging, sightless pain all around her. And a great hurting that faded into darkness. She felt her hands torn from their grip, and knew that she was drowning. She cursed, snarling her hatred of the wave, of the storm, of Carwin. Then there was nothing. 7. In the event of a chosen plan being disrupted, it is important that alternatives are made available. The books of Carwin, soft was the breeze, and gentle the swaying beneath her. She opened her eyes, as yet too dazed to be surprised that she still lived, accepting the fact as an animal accepts it, reacting on pure instinct to the fact of the matter, seeing only that which was before her without any inward reaching for reasons or explanations. The fishing boat floated still, though it was unlikely to sail again. The mast was gone, only a splintered stump, broken off close to the deck, showing where it had once stood. The tiller mounting was a jumble of broken timber, the steering oar itself gone beneath the waves, and all along the deck, broken planking and shattered rails evidenced the fury of the great wave. There was a soft slapping sound close by her head, and when she turned, she saw the surface of the ocean almost level with the ruptured deck. Although still afloat, the vessel was settled low in the water. Its planks almost awash. Its rigging was gone, taken by the storm's fury, so that it drifted helplessly, prey to the vagaries of wind and wave. Weary, conscious of aches and bruises, she lifted to her knees. Farther down the clean-swept deck, there was a huddled bundle of salt-washed black armor that stirred and groaned even as she watched. Too weak to move herself, she waited for the shape to thrust up on outstretched arms, smiling as Spellbinder turned dazed eyes in her direction. "So, we live." He sounded almost cheerful. "What of the others?" Raven cast her gaze over the deck. There was no sign of the boat's master, nor his remaining sailor. Should they have fallen into the shallow hold, they would be drowned by now, but she guessed they had gone overboard when the wave hit. "We are alone, then," said Spellbinder, lifting to his feet and adrift by the look of it. "Can you man the boat?" Raven knew nothing of seafaring, so optimism overruled common sense. "Shall we rig a sail?" Spellbinder chuckled, a bitter sound that contrasted with the calm morning, the tranquil wash of the gentle sea. "There is no sail. Nor any rudder." He glanced over the riven deck. "Not even wood enough to fashion a raft." "We're lost, Raven, drifting until this hulk goes down, then what?" she asked, afraid of the answer she knew must come. "We swim." "To where?" Spellbinder shrugged, looking up at the sun, and pointed away over the blueness. "Carwin should rest in that direction. There's nothing else we'll find here." They stripped to their underclothing, bundling armor and weapons in 2 packs in readiness for the swim. Then they stretched upon the deck, drowsing as the warm sun lulled relief into strained muscles, gathering their strength for the ordeal ahead. The provisions stowed in the hold were tainted with salt water, and those left on deck were long gone into the fury of the storm. They were hungry, their struggling against the elements having depleted their store of energy. Worse, they were thirsty. And the sun was hot. As the waterlogged boat drifted helplessly, it began to settle deeper in the water. Its movement, already sluggish, became slower still, until it seemed as though they hung motionless on the surface of the calm sea. Gradually, the quiet lapping of the softly stirring surface began to overtop the deck's rim, drifting a shallow sheet of brine over the planking. So imperceptible was the advance that neither of them noticed it as the lower decking slid beneath the water. The boat began to sink, settling through the blue ocean to raise the water level up the short spread of stairs separating stern from deck. It rose, inexorably, until it topped the highest step, then crept like some cautious thief across the timbers of the stern. Spellbinder felt the coolness enwrap his legs, and stirred in his sleep. He turned, dropping one outthrust hand into the water. Abruptly, he woke, and shook Raven into awareness of their predicament. "Quick," he warned, "we must be ready to swim. Lest the boat sucks us down with her." "Wait." Raven's voice was commanding, and Spellbinder paused. "Look." She pointed up to where a dim speck hung against the emptiness of the sky. Small, almost too small to see against the brilliance, it appeared to swoop down, growing larger as it descended the thermal currents. It paused for a moment, riding the updraught of air, and they saw widespread wings, stark against the azure, then the wings folded and the shape plummeted seawards. Like a falling star it came, hurtling towards them as though bent on driving itself through their foundering craft. Abruptly, dangerously close to the washing deck, it hoisted dark pinions wide to check its fall, swooping away to one side. Once, twice, it circled them, ivory beak spread wide as it croaked a triumphant call. Then it was gone, beating against the breeze as it skimmed the ocean in a westerly direction. "It was the bird," said Raven, her voice hoarse as its cry from lack of water. "What does it mean?" "That something is near." Spellbinder's throat was parched as hers. "Though what, I cannot guess." "Surely," Raven asked, "it will bring help." "Most like," answered the man. "We'll wait as long as we can. If no help comes, we swim to the west." He looked around, estimating the time they had before the fishing boat went down into the depths, hoping the bird would bring rescue. They were crouched at the farthest point of the stern deck when the bird returned. The sea lapped hungrily about their knees, and they carried their bundled armor ready to pitch it overboard before the vessel went out from under them. The bird circled, screaming as if it called to someone. They climbed to their feet, peering away into the blue haze distance in the direction from which the bird had come, and saw the ship. So low against the sea did it rest that at first they missed it, but as it sped closer, they made out the delineations of its shape. The sail showed first, stark black against the silvery joinder of sky and ocean. its center picked out with a great horn device of violent red. It was a square sail, hung from a single mast that boasted a pennant whipped to crackling straightness by the speed of the boat's passage. To either side of the low-slung shape oars lifted and dipped in unison, striking the sea with scarce a ripple as they drove the ship arrow straight towards the circling bird. As it drew closer, they could make out a great, high-lifting prow, carved to the semblance of a snarling wolf's head. And the onager mounted behind the grinning teeth, Spellbinder's own teeth clamped shut as he saw it, his narrow face drawing tight in an expression of alarm and disapproval. Crag, he grunted through thinned lips. Lifebane wolves have found us. The black craft circled them once, giving Raven a clear view of its long, low lines, the single bank of oars mounted below the deck. At the prow a group of men stood, ready to use the onager, whilst along the length of the deck there were others carrying longbows and javelins. At the stern, its deck planking raised above the rest of the vessel, was a giant of a man, his golden hair streaming from beneath a winged helmet. Spellbinder saw him and groaned one word, Gondar. Raven had no chance to ask what he meant, though it struck her that he appeared anxious to be saved by some other rescuer than this black-hulled wolf ship, for the golden giant swung a grappling hook around his head and hurled it to them. The barbed tines landed neatly over their gunwale, and the huge man began to haul his vessel alongside. Single-handed, he dragged them close enough to reach the deck wall of the wolf ship, then calloused hands stretched down to haul them bodily onto the deck. For a while they rested there, catching their breath as the water drained from their soaking clothing. Raven heard a hoarse cry and looked up to see the black bird winging its way, off to the north. The bird favors you, strangers. The voice was deep, a ringing bass such as might be expected to emanate from a chest half as deep again as any mortal man's. It belonged to the blonde giant, who now stared down from the stern, a smile dancing across his bearded lips. Lucky that it brought us to you from the midst of battle. Battle? Spellbinder stood up, looking towards the giant. Who do you fight? Carwin, answered the giant easily. What other foe is worthy of Gondar Lifebane? I'd heard, said Spellbinder, that Gondar was a wizened magician, too far gone in years to prowl the deck of a wolf ship. And too consumed with anguish and hatred to rescue shipwrecked voyagers. You heard wrong, friend, laughed the giant. And vaulted the stern rail to thud down affront them. Though I'd know from whom you heard it. Why, said Spellbinder evenly, there are widows the length of the southern shore who swear to the tale, and settlements in the nomad kingdoms where luckless survivors tell the same story. Sailors in the Alton's fleet speak of the sea wolf's fury, though still capable of speech. Raven thought that the giant would strike Spellbinder where he stood. Certainly, he was muscled for it, and the great axe he carried so negligently looked to have a blade honed fine enough that a man might shave with it. If he could lift it. But instead, the giant threw back his head and laughed. Aye. The lies told of Lifebane are many, and mightily varied. True it is that the wolf ships pluck a prize now and then, for sore toll is due to those strong enough to take it. But Lifebane never left a man to drown, nor am I wizened, and old. He let his axe fall to the deck, the curved head bedding deep into the smooth planks, and studied the two refugees. Raven wiped Sirac from her eyes and returned his gaze. For the first time, she saw the true measure of his stature, set against Spellbinder's height. Tall was the dark-haired warrior, but this golden-maned colossus towered a full head above him, and where Spellbinder was lean and smoothly muscled, this man was corded and banded with sinews of steel. Atop his head rested a silver helm. Great wings of beaten metal extending out and back from the temples, a broad nosepiece dividing his face. His eyes were gray as a misty morning, shining with mingled amusement and battle-lust from a wide face tanned by wind and sun to the color of soft leather. His hair hung down his shoulders, joining the spread of mustache and beard that hid all but his gleaming teeth. Gold met silver where the hair spread across the links of his mail shirt, from which protruded arms mighty as young oak stems. Torque silver and gold and platinum wound around those huge arms, their brightness contrasting with the dark of his skin. The mail was gathered in by a wide belt of leather, from which hung a wide-bladed knife in a silver-worked sheath. He wore a loincloth of salt-caked linen, and his massive legs were bare except for high sea boots of some waterproof material that shone black as the sun caught them. His axe was of the dark northern metal, the Quan steel, and stood tall as a tall man's waist. Yet he handled the thing like a toy. He was, Raven decided, suppressing a shiver of instinctive desire, the most impressive man she had ever seen. Gondar, for this was none other than the Lifebane himself, appeared equally intrigued by her. Suddenly, she was conscious of her scanty clothing, the sea-wolf's admiring gaze acting as a mirror to remind her. She stood up, damp hair framing her face, tumbling loose to her waist. Wind and water plucked her nipples to hard points beneath the skimpy cloth of her shift. thrusting against the near-transparent material as her breasts rose as though to challenge his stare. The shift reached no farther than her upper thighs, and beneath it she was naked, the clean lines of her legs braced, wide upon the deck. Murmured the giant, "World heart is kind to those she loves. Now she gives me as rich a prize as any sea wolf might dream of." Spellbinder stepped forward. He had retained a slender belt of black sand leather, and through it was thrust a slim dagger. "The girl is prize to no man," he said softly, though his voice carried startling hands to sword and axe hilts. "She is not for the taking." Gondar laughed, plucking his axe from the deck. "What? You'd argue my prize? A naked fish bait would set his little dagger to Gondar's skull cleaver?" "If I must," said Spellbinder, "though it might be that I have other weapons." "As, indeed, have I," chuckled Lifebane. "Though only one is for you. However," he grew thoughtful, "what you say suggests a thing that troubles me. Your pale skin, that hair, they reek of Carwin. Are you of the ghost isle?" Spellbinder shrugged. "Perhaps. Though if you think to make me hostage, there will be little reward in it. You know full well that Carwin, even were I from the island, would not parley for my release. No, Lifebane, what I say is this, the girl and I have come a long way together, and there is a kinship between us. If you want her, then you must fight me. Otherwise there is no honor in it, and much disgrace." "Have I no say in this?" Raven resented the almost casual discussion of her future. "Am I some chattel to be thrown to the victor? I tell you both, I'll pick my own man, and whoever seeks to argue that will have no joy of me, a sea queen." Gondar bellowed. "A veritable daughter of the All-Mother. You please me, pretty one, as much for your spirit as with your body. For too long I've had weak-spined women, too frightened to say me nay. So," he paused, letting his crewman drink in his words. "We'll stay our bout until I've defeated your champion. For that we shall return to Crag." "No," said Raven, her own voice penetrating deep into sudden silence. "You must defeat me." A great stillness settled over the wolf boat, so quiet that gentle lapping of the waves sounded unnaturally loud. Mouths gaped wide in amazement, and eyes stared at the blog Amazon who dared argue her bed with Gondar Lifebane. Long, dangerous moments, Raven watched the giant. Spellbinder's hand hung close by the hilt of his dagger. His body tensed to move on an eye blink's warning. But then the tension evaporated in the gale of laughter bellowing from Gondar's widespread lips. "So be it," he shouted. "If fight you I must, then so I shall we sail for Crag. Turn her north, my wolves. And pray the All-Mother for my victory." Still chuckling, he turned away, calling for men to guide Raven and Spellbinder to the tiny cabin set below the raised stern. There, food and mulled wine was brought to them, and dry clothing. After a while, their armor was returned, though the only weapons Gondar permitted them were the dagger and the throwing stars mounted like ornaments on Raven's the belt. For 2 days they remained in the Spartan room, the only outlook a tiny window set below the poop. On the 3rd day they were summoned on deck and allowed to remain in the open until nightfall. That became the pattern for the remainder of the voyage, which took some 17 days, passing sunset bringing a colder night than the one before until they needed cloaks to warm them when the sun's rays died from the sky. They saw no other vessels, and the sea remained calm, Gondar maintaining an amused distance though his eyes roved eagerly over Raven's body whenever she appeared on the poop. She used much of her time to learn from Spellbinder the history of Gondar's sea reavers. They came, he told her, from the rocky island of Crag sea-bound wilderness to the north of Worldheart. Too inhospitable to afford better than the meagerest of livings, a island had spawned a hardy, seafaring race, cheerfully accustomed to attempting incredible voyages. Fisherfolk at first, they had gradually turned to reaving, cutting holds for themselves on the southern shores of icebound Quan and anywhere else that they could win a standing. Angered by their growing depredations, the grandfather of the present Alton had taken a great fleet out of Karsam to rid the world forever of the irksome islanders. The Alton, Quez Zerfel, had perished with the bulk of his navy. The tattered remnants had struggled back to the east bearing horrendous tales of a massive sea fight in which the free wolf ships had smashed the great slave galleys of Zerfel's fleet. The forces of Crag were led by Gondar's forebear, At the Beheader, and rumor had it that Ud had taken Zerfel's skull himself, to mount as an ornament in his war hall. Battle-maddened by his victory, Ud had attempted an invasion of Carwin. And met total defeat. He died in the struggle and the skull of the Quez Alton, Zerfel, had disappeared. The succession, by birth and by sword, had gone to Valand Utson, the Beheader's son. From Valand it passed to Gorel, and from him to Gondar. Now Gondar Lifebane reigned in Crag, a warrior king as ferocious as his ancestor, Ut, and just as ambitious of conquering the fabled riches of Carwin. But what of the skull? Raven asked. If we are to find Don Wayne, we must first find the skull of Quez. Can these sea wolves help us? Spellbinder smiled, a slow, secret grin. Perhaps they can. Much will depend on the outcome of your combat. Win Gondar's favor, and he might well lend us a wolf boat or two to aid our search. I'll do what I can to influence the outcome. Though I've heard talk of some tame sorcerer who works for Crag, seeking the downfall of Carwin. Again Raven pressed him about the Ghost Isle, and again he refused to answer. It seemed as though he spun a web of words around her mind, tangling her thinking so that she was diverted from her original purpose, steered off into sidetracks leading away from her questions. It was impossible with Spellbinder when he chose not to pursue the matter, though he worked his strange powers upon her to avoid revealing his true background. They reached Crag before she could press the point to a conclusion. They were on deck when the island showed, high and hulking through a grey miasma of Sirac. A wind blew cold and cutting from the north, and prisoners, like the crew, drew cloaks tight around against the biting chill. Crag was a stone dropped into the world-heart sea, wind-washed pinnacles of granite rising up into cloud that hung like smoke above the tips of its ridges. Dark breaks showed in the lower rock, raging foam beating in futile anger against the eternal stone. It was a hard, hostile place, and Raven could understand how it might breed a hard, ferocious people. The wolf ship turned its head directly between two proud jutting points that left no more than a double boat's width between them, and Gondar himself called the stroke as they rushed madcap towards the cleft. The oars dipped furiously, driving the wolf boat at certain destruction, and Raven poised to leap outboard when they hit. But the snarling prow passed arrow straight between the rocks, the oars lifting at the last possible moment to sneak narrowly between the guardians of the bay beyond. Once through the gap, they were in calmer water, and the oars dipped again to take them gentle swift to a wide beach of black sand. Men and women came running to meet them, and Gondar climbed the wolf prow to raise his axe in greeting. As the vessel grounded on the sand, he sprang ashore, landing with a great shout that was quickly drowned by the babble of voices. Then, through the crowd, came a tiny man, dressed all in white, his shining pate yellow in the cold sun, his straggling beard a grubby blot against his tunic. Raven and Spellbinder jumped to the shore in time to hear what he said. How went it, Gondar? Is Carwin thrown down? No, belt his. Gondar Lifebane shook his great head, staring into the black eyes of the mage. The storm came up as you promised. It dispersed the mind mist as you promised. Then it turned and blew against us, so that Krog's boat went down under the fury of it and the rest of us ran like frightened sea cows. Still, he turned, smiling, gesturing at Raven, it brought me a prize I'd not otherwise have found. Even though I must yet win it. Beltis stared, but his gaze was not on Raven. His eyes, black coals in a pallid face, were fixed on Spellbinder, as though he saw a mortal enemy boasting before him, that one. His voice was a sibilant malignancy, envenomed as any serpent's. He is destruction for us all. Kill him. It was ever the way of aging magicians to destroy their rivals, said Spellbinder quickly, loudly, so that all should hear. Age envies youth as weakness envies strength. Kill him. Beltis screamed, spittle flecking his withered lips. Kill him now, before he damns us all. Gondar Lifebane stepped between them, his massive body a barrier through which the old magician's eyes sought to burn. What is this talk of death and danger? Why kill him? Spawn of the Ghost Isle, he. Beltis howled. He carries the stinking taint of Carwin. He was set to lead those demons through the rock mouth, to slay us in our beds. I found him half drowned on a sinking boat. Grunted Lifebane. Still spitting, but nearer the netherworld than Wan. A trick. A trick, you hulking savage. They set him there to bait you, and you took it like a fish jumping to the net. And the girl? Gondar's voice was harsh, his hackles rising at the mage's insults. Is she bait, too? For the first time, Beltis turned his eyes to Raven, letting them linger on her figure. Then his head moved reluctantly from side to side, the corners of his thin mouth turning down. No. Though I sense something about her that smacks of danger. She has an aura of power that I cannot understand. That she does, chuckled Gondar, and rubbed his loins suggestively. One that I sense clearly enough. Fool, snarled Beltis. You let your lust guide your senses, keep the girl and kill the man. Now. Gondar shook his head. No. The man faced me bravely, and he speaks for the girl. If Raven wills his death, then so be it. Not otherwise. There is another way. Spellbinder's voice startled the watching audience. If the Old One feels threatened, let him face me in a duel of magic. Yes. He turned his blue gaze on Lifebane, staring intently at the massive sea wolf. I know some tricks of the sorcerer's art, though I bring no Carwin fleet to reave you, nor seek to end your own raiding. I am no more than a lost traveler. If Beltis feels me such a threat, let him pit his powers against mine. Were he younger, I'd call for sword settlement, but if he is the mage who guides your struggle against the Isle of Ghosts, then let him stand against me in magical combat. What say you, Beltis? Lifebane asked, intrigued. Will you do this? Surely, snarled the old magician, though if I lose, it is you, Gondar Lifebane, who will be sorry. The holding was alive with gossip as the two prisoners were herded to Gondar's hall. Feelings appeared mixed, there being those who saw them as enemies and consequently backed Beltis in his demands for Spellbinder's death, and those who doubted the powers of the old mage. Anticipating goodly sport in the magical combat, Gondar himself appeared indifferent, holding to a middle line that offended neither side of the quarrel. Certainly, he housed them well enough, in a room apiece, each hung with rich furs against the cold, thick carpets taken from Saran and Varthanian ships over the boards of the floor. Water and perfumes were brought that they might cleanse themselves, and flasks of wine with platters of sweetmeats. All in all, it was as though they were honored guests. Rather than captives liable to die on a moment's whim, it was agreed that both men should have one day in which to prepare for the contest, which Gondar proposed to hold in his war hall the following nightfall. Spellbinder closeted himself in his room, leaving Raven to explore the holding under the admiring eyes of Lifebane. Even were she not guarded, there was little of chance of escape, for the settlement clung to the walls of the rock-bound bay as a limpet fastens to a steep-scarped sea stone. Its buildings were of weathered timber, guarded on the water's edge by a high palisade, on all other sides by the cliffs. A single, narrow trail wound upwards from the beach to the high meadows, a watchtower standing at the crest, where a view of both sea and land was commanded by the permanent guards. There were, Gondar explained, other holdings on the island, and crag settlements farther afield still, all owing allegiance to him as High King. His pride in the place was obvious, and Raven found her liking for the blonde giant growing. Night approached before he led her back to the great hall, where his people were already gathering in anticipation of the sorceress conflict. Beltis was waiting for them, seated at one end of the long central table, his wizened face set in a scowl. He wore robes of white still, though cleaner than those of the previous day, and his wispy beard was combed and oiled. Silver bracelets ringed his forearms, and around his head was set a circlet of platinum carved with tiny runes. Spellbinder entered from the far side of the hall. Dressed in a tunic of black, his dark hair falling free. A negligent smile decorated his lips, and when Raven caught his eye he raised a hand in greeting. Before taking his place at the table, Gondar ushered Raven to a carven seat midway between the two men, and wine was brought as the reavers and their women settled around the combatants. Beltis fidgeted, though whether from nervousness or impatience, Raven could not tell. Spellbinder appeared calm, almost casual, but a certain tightness about his mouth and his eyes told the girl that he assumed a carelessness he did not feel. The room fell silent as Gondar looked from Beltis to Spellbinder, his voice deep and commanding. May the All-Mother smile upon virtue. May her hand guide you, that her chosen shall win. Now begin. 8. The true power of a man lies within himself, though there are times when external aid may be needed. The books of Carwin, Beltis exposed a jagged line of blackened teeth, mumbling as he shifted his hands in the air before him. Abruptly, the reed torches flickered as though a strong breeze wafted through the hall, then they went out, plunging the room into darkness. There was a muttering, part appreciative, but largely nervous. The sound became a gasp as brilliance, brighter than any burning torch might produce, filled the hall. Spellbinder smiled, setting both hands upon the table before him. He rested back in his seat, waiting for the older man to make the next move. Beltis snarled, shifting his gnarled fingers in devious patterns. A drinking horn ripped loose from a warrior's grasp to rush at Spellbinder's face. Before the contents could slop into his eyes, the dark-haired man motioned with his left hand, halting the thing in midair. He gestured again, and the wine rose up from the horn in a quavering globule that began to drift along the table, level with Beltis' head. It stopped just above his plate, its surface shifting, stretching. It elongated, seeming to spout ears, the braying mouth of a donkey, and it settled upon Beltis, so that he appeared as a jackass. There was a shout of laughter, and Spellbinder moved his hand again. The empty horn floated back to its owner, and when it reached him it was brimful of wine. Beltis mumbled something and the donkey head became a corona of flame that burned in a great aureole around him. Spellbinder pointed, the flame went out. Beltis grunted and the table lifted into the air. For a moment it hung there, then, with a sudden rush, it hurtled at Spellbinder's chest. Raven gasped, thinking to see her companion crushed, but the great wooden object stopped as though smashed against a wall of stone. Instead of hitting Spellbinder, it tilted, the end nearest him lifting up. He murmured too low for even the closest ears, and a mound of rotten fruit materialized, spilling down the planking to splatter. Against Belthus' robe, the table settled back upon the flagstones, the fruit evaporating as the older mage chanted an incantation. He chopped one hand downwards and a thunderclap filled the hall with a deafening sound. A flash, and lightning arced at Spellbinder. It hit an empty chair, black scorch marks evidence of its ferocity. Your temper phrase, warlock. Spellbinder stood behind Belthus, grinning as the magician turned to face him. He moved his hands, blocking off a second blast of white fire that rebounded and would have consumed the white-robed one had he not drenched it in a sudden squall of rain that evaporated before it touched the floor. Carwin scum. Belthus cursed Spellbinder's back as the younger man resumed his seat. You dare too much. A fire burned suddenly in the air above the table. It coalesced into a writhing shape that stank and roared as does an angered beast. Red it was, and black, touched about with yellow lights that became eyes and curved, sharp teeth. The eyes glowed within a fire-dark body that was both shaped and yet amorphous. It was impossible to define the exact contours of that creature, yet it was hideous. Loathsome, and alien to any but the inhabitants of some hell pit. A stomach-churning odor of burning flesh and odor came from the thing, and where its great, clawed feet touched the wood, burns appeared. Slowly, as though it was unsure of where it was, the creature stalked towards Spellbinder, paws of flame reached for him, talons hooking to rend and tear. And a black bird materialized before the thing. Raven gasped, recognizing the avian, and beside her, Gondar stiffened. Then their full attention was caught by the battle raging above the floor. Fire Beast reached for Shadowbird. Wings beat furiously as beak darted, stabbing at ethereal flame. The biped creature lashed angrily at the flapping shape, and the bird lifted, plunging talons into the arms, ripping chunks of stinking fire that fell and smoldered on the stones around them. A great silence filled the hall as men stared open-mouthed at the struggle. It was fought in silence, for neither creature uttered one sound, though black beak and snarling jaws stretched wide, and the flame spotting the floor burned silently. Without giving heat, how long it went on, no man could say, but after a while the flame creature seemed to diminish, its body growing smaller as more of its incorporeal substance was torn away. At last it stumbled, falling to its knees with the bird still hacking at its weaving head. Gradually, it fell in upon itself, until only a single flicker remained. The bird darted its beak forwards, gulping down the last flame as though hungry. It beat its wings once, twice, and then was gone, swift as a shadow in a suddenly brightened room. A murmur of nervous whispering impinged on the silence. Seawolves who had come to the hall expecting a night's entertainment were now aware of the raw hatred emanating from Belthus, knew that they witnessed a magical struggle that must end in death. There were some who muttered for the duel to continue, anticipating the blood struggle, but most called for it to end. Gondar's reavers, whilst ferociously careless of death in sword battle, entertained a healthy mistrust of the sorceress arts. Fearing the demon creatures a mage might call to his aid. There was no telling where such a battle might end, for a hell beast, victorious, could as easily turn on those around it as obey the command of its summoner. Gondar was of the latter belief, and called out for the duel, to end. Belthus mouthed an inarticulate curse and turned burning eyes upon the king. Again Gondar called for them to stop, to drink from the peace cup and forget their rivalry. Spellbinder smiled, shrugging his acceptance. Belthus spat. At this insolence, Gondar came to his feet, his eyes blazing. And fell back onto the chair as a puppet drops when its strings are cut. The blaze died from his eyes, the grey clouding so that he lolled, staring vacantly ahead, all strength fled from his limbs. Beside him, Raven lifted, reaching for the throwing stars set around her belt. She felt the cold touch of the metal, but as she drew one star free, a greater cold seeped through her limbs and the weapon refused to pull loose. With a shock of horror, for despite her friendship with Spellbinder, overt magic still awed her, she realized that she was unable to move. As surely as the paralyzing darts of the sly cannibals, so did the eyes of the old man still her body. She glimpsed a sea-wolf rising with a small throwing axe slung back to cleave Belthus' skull, and across the hall, she saw men lift spears and blades in defense of their king. Belthus laughed, and it was an eerie sound, and wove patterns in the air. A curtain of pale fire sprang up around the table, enclosing both the mage and Spellbinder. As weapons hit that weird curtain, they cracked and fell to the stones as though rebounding from a solid wall. Belthus chanted a ritual incantation and the war hall fell silent again. All around, the men and women of Gondar's holdings slumped in their chairs, those seated on benches falling across the planks, though their eyes remained fixed on the central tableau. through all this, Spellbinder had remained silent. Sitting calmly as Beltis wove his protective spells, now he spoke. There is no need for this to go farther. Let it end before powers too great to control usurp our command. Beltis gave no reply, simply glaring at the younger man, with moving lips and shifting hands. Frost sparkled on Spellbinder's hair and clothing, his breath came in great misty clouds, and ice sheened his eyes. Then it was gone as a light like summer sunshine irradiated his position. Fire followed, then more frost. A hurricane wind howled and lightning flickered within the fire curtain. All died as Spellbinder wove his counterspells. In return for the frost, he wreathed Beltis in sweet-smelling roses. For the fire, he gave a spray of gentle, scented rain, for the lightning, a pair of doves that settled, cooing, upon the mage's shoulders, and these things angered Beltis far more than any violent reply. The sorcerer half rose from his seat, glowering his hate. Boils that burst pustulence over Spellbinder's face and hands erupted with horrible abruptness. The dark man groaned, feeling the pain of inflamed flesh. Then the boils were gone and a great crowd of white mice scurried squealing down the table to the white-robed magician. They almost reached him, but then a horde of huge, black spiders stood across their path. Furred bodies the size of a man's clenched fist crouched on angular, hook-ended legs. Many-faceted eye clusters glinted a dark, unholy light as gleaming mandibles gaped wide. In a sudden rush, the spiders scuttled forwards, pouncing on the mice. Mandibles clicked, though where they closed on white-furred bodies, the sound was soggier, more nauseating. They crouched over the mice, obscene, round heads lifting with ragged chunks of flesh held tight. Soundless, they were, their only noise the click of curved jaws and the horrible sucking as they drew in fresh blood. The mice squealed piteously as they died, many crawling with gaping wounds in their white coats, seeking to escape the loathsome arachnids. None did. For the spiders poured venom from their jaws that stilled the mice until all were stiff and silent. For a long time there was only the crunch of tiny, breaking bones and the tearing of flesh. Then the ghastly things rose and scuttled down the table, mandibles clacking as their multiple eyes fastened on Spellbinder's body. The man in black sat as though exhausted, for magic is known to strain the body. But the sheer hideousness of the approaching horde stirred him to action. For the first time he summoned fire to his defense, wafting a sheet of flame down upon the scuttling monsters so that the bristling fur sparked, bright and the huge legs withered, dropping crackling black bodies to the wood of the table. They writhed, the ichor within their bulbous bellies seething, boiling. Mandibles rattled a mad, flesh-lustful tune, and they died and were gone in the cleansing flame. Beltis touched the circlet of platinum girding his temples, staring down at Spellbinder. The latter slumped back suddenly, as though his joints stiffened, tightening up themselves. His face grew lines, the skin parching, wrinkling, and his hair became gray. It was as though years passed in seconds, age creeping over his body with each breath drawn. His hair shaded from gray to silver, to a dull, yellowish white. Teeth clattered upon the table as withered lips sucked in on dried-out gums. His eyes misted with rheum, closing upon themselves as his fingers sprouted in large joints that turned the tips to claws, hooking inwards towards the palms. His shoulders slumped and curved, rising up around a neck grown scrawny, wizened, and his spine crooked, bending him close over the table. At the other end, Beltis aged in the opposite direction. Hair sprouted from his yellowed pate, falling in thick locks of reddish-brown as his sunken cheeks filled out, his eyes grew clearer. He sat upright in his chair, shoulders back and chest swelling enough to strain the seams of his white robe. As Spellbinder became an old man, so did Beltis grew young. Passed from age to middle age, was a man in the prime of his manhood. Then he became a youth, a beardless boy, a child. His robes were too large for his diminishing frame, the high-backed chair too tall. Soon, he was forced to lift himself to see above the table's edge, then his legs were too weak to support him. A squalling cry burst from lips that had forgotten the art of speech, and a blank-faced baby huddled, whimpering, in the chair. There was a flash of light that turned the hall to shimmering fire, and Spellbinder was himself again. Of Beltis, there was no sign. His chair was empty, only the burn marks down the table and the rotten odor of scorched flesh to record his disappearance. Spellbinder motioned with tired hands and the hall came alive again. The curtain of fire was gone with Beltis, now the sea-wolves came awake, torches and braziers flickered back to life, and the cold brilliance that had taken their place faded away. Spellbinder slumped, his face drawn as might be a man's after a hard-fought battle. Where is he? Gondar Lifebane was the first to break the silence. I'd see Beltis' skull on a pole. Perhaps you shall, muttered Spellbinder. But not now. What little power was left him, he has used to flee. Where, I cannot say, but gone he is, without a doubt. Ungrateful pig, snarled Gondar. I found him cast adrift, roped to a lost boat to die for whatever sins he had committed. I took him in when he said he could aid me in conquering the Ghost Isle. And he spits at his rightful liege lord. Hear me. He turned to the assembled company. This man, this spellbinder, has defeated Beltis. By battle right and my favor, he has hold brotherhood amongst us. He is of Crag, now. Who speaks against him, speaks against the life-bane. There was a shout of agreement and of relief, for many were glad to see Beltis go, and more grateful for the ending of the demonic fight, and the reavers settled gladly to feasting and drinking to dispel the dark memories of Ensor Clement. Amongst them, Spellbinder and Raven sat as honored guests, the sea-wolves regarding with awe the man who had dared to face Beltis the warlock in a duel of magic. More odd still that the castaway had won. That and Gondar's unhidden regard for Raven, set them as equals in the feast, and those who had not yet heard of their quest or their coming plied them with shouted inquiries. Gondar let it go on long enough to take the edge off the tension, then, while his men settled to serious drinking, posed questions of his own. Why seek you the skull? It was lost in its day, no man alive knows where it rests now. Most like on the bottom of world heart, no. Spellbinder sipped his wine, staring moodily into the carved goblet. When the stone speaks, it speaks true. Were the thing lost, we'd not have been told to seek it. Unless there be some reason why you should not go to Karsam, suggested Gondar. Don Wayne is in Karsam, interrupted Raven, a cold light in her eyes, so there I go. With or without the skull, in any event, murmured Spellbinder, the stone would have spoken against going were that the design. The suction alone means the skull may be found. How is another matter? I, grinned Gondar. Another matter for another day, more immediate is the claiming of my battle right. He turned laughing eyes on Raven, letting them roam over the contours of her body until she almost blushed at the naked appraisal. Spellbinder stifled a chuckle and rose from his seat, excusing himself from further feasting. And, indeed, he appeared drawn by his ordeal, so his departure went largely unremarked. Shortly after Raven followed him, though not before Gondar had extracted her promise to meet him the next morning to settle their contest. At the center of the holding was a circle of short-cropped turf, ringed round with blackwood poles from which fluttered bright strips of cloth. Each pole represented 1 year of the holding's existence, each ribbon, a duel. Beyond that symbolic boundary an expectant crowd was gathered. Within it, as Raven crossed the yard, stood 3 men. Spellbinder she recognized instantly, Gondar too, the third she had noticed in the hall without learning his name. Now Gondar introduced him, Evo Holdmaster. Guardian of Crag in the king's absence. He was a tall, gray-bearded man on whose body age served only to further outline the cording of his muscles. He held 2 axes, 2 swords, 2 spears, all blunted so that they would bruise without killing, and 2 metal-studded bucklers of wood and zand hide. Choose, he said without preamble. All may be used, and I shall judge which blows strike true. In accordance with our custom you may forfeit your right to battle and submit to the will of Lifebane. How say you? Battle, answered Raven, selecting her weapons. Gondar laughed, planting spear and sword in the turf, swinging the axe to rest over his shoulder. He wore a shirt of hardened ear leather, close-fitted leggings of some softer material, and high boots. He scorned the shield Evo offered him, and Raven did the same. She had donned her armor, knowing full well how a blow delivered by Gondar's huge arms might damage her. Speed, she thought, was her best advantage, for the Lifebane had both the strength and the reach to smash her with one blow. Should it chance to land. And she held little doubt but that he would join battle as fervently as though it were for real. Accompanied by Spellbinder, she retreated across the circle. The dark man said nothing, simply rested a hand upon her shoulder, squeezing gently as he smiled into her eyes. Raven smiled back and lifted her sword. Let it begin, called Evo, retreating from the dueling ground. Gondar roared, his great body hurtling forwards as the axe whistled in an arc at Raven's midriff. She countered, jumping to the side to let the swinging blade pass before her as her own darted in to cut at his ribs. The edge touched as Gondar spun aside, reversing his swing to bring the axe back along its path in a blow that would have tumbled Raven to the ground had it landed. Instead, she was gone from beneath it, slashing blunted steel at his ankles. The sole of his boot, hard-tanned hide and metal plating took the force of the blow, jarring her arm as the axe came up and over to crash down onto the deflected sword. Raven felt a great shudder run through her and dropped the blade before Gondar's blow could numb her grip. She pitched back, rolling as the flat of the axe swung at her head. Lifting to her feet she reached, instinctively, for the throwing stars girdled at her waist, then remembered, cursing, that this was only a mock duel, and grabbed instead for the spear. She grasped the pole in both hands, moving sideways around the circle as Gondar bellowed his appreciation of her skill and closed in. The axe swung like a toy before him, arcing to right and left in a flashing curtain of impenetrable metal through which she sought to thrust the spear. Once she drove through to jab at his side, but then the axe smashed the wood away and she fell back to avoid a crushing blow. She moved cat-like around the perimeter of the circle, using the spear to hold Gondar at bay as the blonde giant sought to smash aside her guard. Sheer strength was his greatest asset, though that was allied with a deftness of movement inbred through years of sea fighting. And a sure battle knowledge. Against those skills Raven brought her own talents into play. She was faster than Gondar, and Arger's teaching had fixed firmly in her mind, becoming honed by their outlaw raiding to a razor-keen sense of opportunity. Once, twice, then again, she drove the spear past the sea-wolf's defense, striking on ribs and thighs. The watching crowd howled their appreciation, counting the hits, urging her on. Had she fought any other man, Evo would have deemed her the victor, for a real spear would have wounded to such an extent that loss of blood and muscle damage would slow him to the point of an easy kill. But Gondar Lifebane was no ordinary man, the scars she had seen on his body attested to that. He would go on fighting when another was weak unto death. So the combat continued. It went on until Raven was unaware of passing time, conscious only of the growing weight of the spear, of her slowing movements. Gondar, untired, pressed harder, driving her back. Exhaustion, Arger had warned her, can kill as surely as a blade. When the sword rests heavy in your hand, then is the time to run. To flee and fight again is better than to stay and die, but within the dueling area there was nowhere to run, and so, more desperate measures had to be taken. Gauging her timing, she let the spear droop, allowing Gondar's axe to swing closer. As the reaver closed in, she withdrew around the circle, luring him on until she deemed her position suitable to her purpose. A curving blow glanced the spear aside, swinging back to connect with her ribs. It passed, close, and as the apex of the swing was reached, Raven thrust the spear between Gondar's legs, twisting savagely. The man yelled out and fought to retain his balance, but she turned the pole, tumbling him down. As he fell, she hurled herself at her fallen sword, now within reach, rolling as her hand closed on the hilt, slashing automatically as she rose to her feet. Gondar was on one knee, axe lifted defensively, as she thrust forwards. Blade met blade with a dull clashing sound, then Raven was in over his guard. She saw the blunted tip touch beneath his lower ribs and felt a great blow pitch her sideways. The sky spun above her head and the turf seemed to club her back. Around the circle a great cheer went up. And through it she heard the bellow of Gondar's laughter. Hands grasped her, lifting her, and she saw Spellbinder's smiling face, beyond it, Evo's. The Holdmaster appeared both amused and surprised, his arms lifted above his head to silence the cheering audience. It is ended. His cry carried over the hold. The duel was well fought. Were it real, both blades should carry blood. Raven noticed that he held 3 ribbons in his left hand, red, black, and green. He took the green, turning so that all saw it before tying it to that year's post. Over her shoulder, Spellbinder murmured, "A red shows hold victory, black, a defeat. Green is for a drawn combat." There were very few green pennants. Her shoulders heaved as she listened to Evo announce his judgment, and she was suddenly aware of a great weariness that seemed to filter through her limbs to concentrate in legs that began to tremble, threatening to spill her down. Before she could fall, Gondar stood before her, teeth gleaming through the luxuriance of his beard. He reached out. His great hands gentle, to grasp her waist, lift her. She rose into the air and a throng of sea-wolves surged forward, pushing for the right to chair her on broad shoulders. Gondar set her between 2 men who paraded through the shouting, cheering crowd as Gondar marched before, acknowledging her right to determine her own destiny. That right she chose to exercise after the celebratory feast. The noonday she passed in bath and steam house, nursing bruises from her body, applying salves and unguents to ease the aches. Then, dressed in a borrowed robe of sea green silk worked round with silver thread, she went to the hall. A path was cleared for her, leading to the high seat on Gondar's right. Spellbinder sat to the High King's left, deep in conversation with Evo, though both fell silent as Gondar stood to welcome her. The Lord of Crag settled her in the throne-like chair as he would have a queen, then turned to his waiting people. "This woman," his voice was solemn. "This Raven, is an honored guest. Who speaks against her, speaks against me. Since I took the high throne no man has defeated me, no man who has entered the circle with me has walked from it. As though she were born here, so is Raven a sister of Crag. How say you?" The shouting gave fair answer, and Raven's acceptance into the brotherhood of sea wolves was toasted until the serving women ran for fresh wine to replenish the waning supplies. It carried on late into the night, until men began to slump on the benches and the torches spluttered and burned out. Raven had eaten sparingly, sufficient to satisfy her hunger without the leaden feeling of excess, and drank in the same fashion. She was relaxed, the wine imparting a pleasant languor that was heightened by the easy companionship of Gondar's people. As the hall dimmed and the hubbub of conversation fell away to a wave of murmuring, Gondar bent close to her ear. Throughout the feasting he had maintained a meticulous politeness, treating her with the reverence accorded an equal and respected guest. Now he spoke in a low voice, too soft and low for any ears but hers. You won your hold right in fair combat, Raven, but I must confess a desire that it had gone otherwise. How so? Raven's eyes flirted with Gondar's sea-grey stare. Had I won, a smile curved his lips, then I'd have claimed bedright. As was my first intent. Why, her smile answered his, surely a gift given freely is more pleasurable than one taken by force. For a moment her words failed to penetrate, but then Gondar's smile broadened and a deep chuckle burst from his mouth. True, he agreed, but there are times a man has no wish to wait on the giver. Then, my lord, she murmured, let us make the giving. Swiftly, abruptly, Gondar stood, extending a torque-ringed arm to help her to her feet. Raven took it, walking from the hall at Gondar's side, oblivious to the envious stares of the sea wolves or the faintly unhappy glance Spellbinder directed at her retreating back. I thought her to be your woman, Evo Holdmaster remarked with the careful diplomacy of one long used to settling internal disputes. Holdright grants you a say in such matters. No, answered Spellbinder. Raven belongs to no man. She walks her own path to a high destiny. It is not for me to say her nay, or yea. So be it, murmured Evo. As you wish. So it goes, said the dark man softly. But there was sadness in his voice. Gondar's quarters were rich with hanging tapestries and carefully worked shields. Thick furs covered the floor and a single brazier suffused the room into which he led Raven with a soft amber glow. A carven table offered wine in a silver-chased carafe, and as she sipped Raven studied the place, waiting for Gondar to sluice his face in cold water and comb his beard. A huge bed, spread with dark furs occupied the center of the room, and her eyes were drawn irrevocably towards it. Gondar, joining her by the table, followed her gaze, smiling as he noted where it led. My lady. His hands were gentle as he took her cup, setting it down. She turned to face him, staring up. Letting one hand rest against his broad chest. A gift freely given brings pleasure to both giver and receiver. His arms closed around her and she was lifted off her feet as he crossed the furs in 2 long strides. The bed creaked once as he set her down and sank to her side, then the room was silent as she drew him to her, her tongue thrusting deep. Her hands moved over his clothing, tugging at fastenings, drawing surcoat and shirt from his torso, moving down to breeks and boots. Gondar rested still. Letting her undress him, only his quickened breathing disturbing the urgent silence. When he was naked, she slipped from the bed, working on her own clothing. The sea-green gown fell like foam around her legs and the reaver lifted up on one elbow, his eyes full of admiration. Raven stood for a moment, her nipples hardening as she felt his gaze like a caress upon her, then, deliberately provocative, she slowly unfastened the silver circlet binding her hair. Gold tumbled over honeyed skin. And a deep groan burst from Gondar. He reached towards her, his eyes lustful. Raven smiled, enjoying the power she exercised over his body, and moved into his arms. He circled her hips as she stood above him, pressing ardent lips to her firm breasts, her belly, her thighs. A moan formed deep in her throat as she felt his tongue, her own desire mounting so that she fell across him, pushing him down onto the fur-decked bed. Slowly, despite her passion, she began to caress his body, lips and tongue tracing the contours of the scars he wore like battle honors. Working downwards from neck to waist, then lower still. His manhood filled her, near choking her, though so great was her desire, that she took him in until he gasped and, thrust against her. His hands, powerful yet gentle, took her breasts, kneading, stroking until she cried out and lifted up to straddle him. Gondar looked up through half-closed eyes, feeling a new warmth enfold him. Raven's head was thrown back, her lips parted as she rose up and thrust down against him, sucking him in. Playing with him. Slowly, then faster, she moved in counterstroke to his own driving shaft. He reached out to her breasts, and she stooped to kiss him. She drew back, her breath coming now in gasps that were torn from the burning core that seemed to fill the center of her being. Her movements became more urgent as her eyes closed tight and slow, heaving spasms began to shudder through her body. The sea-wolf felt her trembling as his own body tightened, his chest heaving in long, slow sighs. His back arched, lifting her from the bed, and she thrust down against him, ramming frantically towards the explosion of pleasure that was now only heartbeats away. The core that grew within her seemed to rise up, spreading out to encompass her entire body until it became a pleasurable agony that demanded release. Then light danced before her eyes and she screamed her delight as Gondar's heaving loins raised her into the air and a great, guttural cry exploded from his chest. They shook and shuddered in unison, their bodies conjoined in racking spasms that left them both drained, simultaneously fulfilled yet emptied. Raven sighed, stretching out atop the reverse chest. Gondar folded her into his arms, burying his face in her dampened hair. And they slept. 3 times that long night they woke as though by mutual consent and loved again, and in the morning Gondar's steward found them curled in tumbled furs, sleeping past cock's crow. Grinning, the man left fresh baked bread, meats and cheeses, a jug of steaming, aromatic chafa, and a pitcher of spring water. Gondar awoke as the man set the stuff down, rising to pour water. His thirst slaked, he brought food to Raven where she rested on the great bed. They were both mightily hungry and the breakfast was eaten in silence, a sense of companionship filling the sunlit room. So, said Gondar as he cradled a mug of chafa, sword skill is not your only talent. Nor axe-wielding yours, answered Raven. Gondar laughed, touching her hair. Stay with me, Raven. You're a fitting queen of crag. We'll rule the holdings together, and when the wolf boats ride the waves you'll stand beside me, mistress of land and ocean. No. Raven shook her head. Tempting though you be, to rule crag is not my destiny. What is? Gondar's voice was partly curious, partly resentful. To wander the world with Spellbinder, perhaps, murmured Raven. He has proved a noble companion, as should I, said Gondar. And more besides. I'll make you a queen, bring you riches. Why, there was a hint of reluctance. Now, I'll make Spellbinder my lieutenant. Raven laughed, stroking the reaver's chest. You do me too much honor, Gondar, and I am greatly flattered. But still I must say no. I cannot tell you what destiny I follow, for I am not sure myself, except that when the stone spoke to me I knew I must follow its instructions. I must find the skull of Quez, return it to the Alton in Karsam. Only in that way will Carl Ir Don Wayne come beneath my blade. You want Don Wayne so badly. Gondar's tone implied statement, not question. Raven nodded, a coldness coming into her eyes, the blue sparkling hate so that Gondar's chin drooped onto his chest and his own gaze clouded. I could lead Crag against Karsam to hand you Don Wayne's head for a bride gift. No, Gondar. Raven set a hand upon his corded forearm. It must be me who slays him, and to win that prize I must find the skull. Why, or how, I know not, any more than I understand why I trust the words of the stone. But trust them I do. So be it, muttered Gondar. Then, in a louder tone, finding the skull of Quez be your task, then I'll help you. Wolf boats roam far and if I can hold you no longer than the sea journey. At least I'll stand beside you in that. He rose, crossing to the bathhouse door where he turned, a slow smile replacing his frown of disappointment. I'll have Evo ready the men. An honest fight will be welcome, and I've a feeling we'll need strong blades to back us. We sail in 3 days' time, my lady. 9. A straight path is not necessarily the shortest, at times it is better to approach an objective obliquely. The books of Carwin, lean and low, the wolf boats rode at anchor, readied for the sailing. Gondar Lifebane's own black-sailed Stormrunner was flanked by a green-gray vessel named Worldbane, captained by Toril Grunsun. Both commanders, like their waiting crews, were anxious to be off, eager to feel the heaving boards beneath their feet again. The weather was clear, a stiff wind blowing from the east. Provisions were stowed, weapons readied, yet they held to the anchorage. Impatient though the sea wolves grew, Raven refused to sail, waiting for Spellbinder to give the word. For 3 days the dark warrior had roamed the island alone, taciturn, answering questions in monosyllables that left the askers as devoid of satisfaction as though he had not spoken at all. He refused to say what he waited for, and had it not been for Raven standing with the Lord of Crag, Gondar would have sailed on chance hope alone. As it was, he chafed against the delay, growing irritable to the point where only Raven's seductive blandishments held him to the land. He checked and rechecked Stormrunner, until it appeared as though the wolf boat herself surged against her anchor ropes in a fury of impatience. Yet still they waited. Then, on the 4th day, Spellbinder came racing down from the upland meadows. His black-clad figure took the Barrow Trail at a headlong pace, legs flailing and arms spread wide to keep his balance. Straight through the holding, he ran, ignoring the curious stares, the shouts that followed his passage. He reached the landing and seized the hammer of the great warning gong that hung from its dark frame where wharf joined rock. 3 times he struck the oval of hammered metal, striking deep bell tones loud through the still air. Before the last echo had died away, he was on the afterdeck of Gondar's vessel, shouting for the others to join him. They were there in moments, casting free the mooring ropes and hauling the anchors. The square black sails lifted to the mast tops as men took their positions at the oars. Gondar called the stroke and Stormrunner nosed out through the bottleneck guarding the cove with Worldbane hard astern. Where do we point her? Gondar's shout was joyful, the wind that whipped at beard and hair bringing a smile to his face. What course? Spellbinder pointed west, follow the bird. Raven looked to where he pointed, and her breath was sucked in with a gasp of surprise. Beating the wind-lashed air with pinions of black was a great dark shape, almost too distant to be visible. It seemed to hang motionless, save for the heavy striking of its widespread wings. It rode the air currents until the two wolf boats had come within bow shot, then, uttering a hoarse cry, it turned its great head westwards and began to flap away across Worldheart. Gondar watched it, turning the steering oar to head Stormrunner after it, an expression of wonderment and awe upon his tanned face. 3 times now has that bird come to your aid. He grunted to Spellbinder. First during the storm, when it threatened to rip our sail and evaded every arrow we fired so that we followed it and it led us to you. Secondly, in the hall, when Beltis sent his fire demon against you, the bird or its shadow guarded you again. Now, when we wander on our direction, so it comes back. What is it? Is it mortal flesh, or some spirit thing? Instinctively, he touched the blue-painted eye, symbol of the Allmother, carved into the great steering oar. Spellbinder saw the gesture and smiled reassuringly. No spirit, friend Gondar, but a living creature. Somewhat different to its feathered brethren, but mortal as you or I. It reeks of Carwin, stated the Reaver, moodily, and its presence reminds me of a doubt I'd put aside. You, Spellbinder, are you of the Ghost Isle? If I were. Spellbinder diverted the conversation somewhat. Should I then be your enemy? You draw dilemmas from the open sky, rumbled Gondar. I've sworn brotherhood with you. And you know I'll not go back on that, but Carwin is another matter. Why so? Raven entered the conversation. Why do you war with the Ghost Isle? Not war, fair one, grinned the Life Bane, but a sea wolf's curiosity. We of Crag sail where we will, take sword, toll as it pleases us. We've traveled to the corners of the world, tasted the luxuries of the southern kingdoms and clashed steel with Karsam. Our wolf boats have grounded on Quan's frozen shores and along the inlets of Ishkar. Zand, and Sly. Men know us in Quell and Terwind, and a myriad other places that have opened their gates to us or suffered the penalty for inhospitality. Only Carwin stands aloof, its shores hidden by the magic mist. Crag would know what lies behind that mist, and so long as the sorcerer priests deny us free passage I'll seek to penetrate their defenses. Be the bird of Carwin, or not, said Raven, it has helped me in the past. It means me no ill, and so cannot be harmful to you while you aid me. Fairly said, answered Gondar. We'll not chance a friendship on doubts. How say you, Spellbinder? He ended his sentence with a backslap that threatened to pitch the black-armored warrior overboard. Fairly said, gasped Spellbinder. Follow the bird, for its flight guides us to the skull of Quez, and where so rich a prize is stored, I'll wager there's more wealth to make the voyage worth your while. The moment of dissension was past and they continued westwards without further discussion of Carwin or Spellbinder's origins. Throughout the days the bird soared effortlessly ahead of them, setting at night in the rigging, from where a raucous croaking warned of any deviation from their course. They continued in this manner for 9 days, the weather remaining unnaturally calm, the wind blowing ever strong from the east, sending them smoothly over the sea that might have been glass for its uninterrupted tranquility. Then, on the 10th day, the bird veered southwards, drawing Stormrunner and Worldbane after it as a magnet might draw filings from a sword's blade. For 10 more days they traveled in a southwesterly direction, veering slowly around until they were headed west again. It was, Raven thought, as though the bird took them deliberately north and west of Carwin, choosing its path to avoid any possible temptation the Ghost Isle might exert on the sea wolves. They saw no other ships, and after some 30 sunsets their provisions grew low and Gondar thought of steering for the nearest landfall to replenish their supplies. There were islands dotting the surface of Worldheart. And though most were uninhabited, there were a few that bore small settlements on their lonely flanks. The bird, however, steered them between such temptations, drawing them ever westwards, and Spellbinder's persuasive tongue convinced the reavers against a landing. On the 37th day they sighted a low, rolling coastline. Gondar climbed the wolf-headed prow, peering out through the haze at the dark line breasting the horizon. After a while he climbed down, announcing the place as Ishkar. He would have gone in then had the bird not turned due south, taking them down the coast past tiny settlements where watchfires sparkled to carry warning of their passage. Instead, they continued for 2 days longer, following the line of tempting, green-girded sea meadows. Then, opposite a wide river mouth, the bird turned inland, beating up the center of the channel to a place where the green-gray of the ocean became the clear blue of pure water. There was a wide sward of verdant grass running clear to the river's edge, girded on either side by low hills, from whence ran a crystal stream to feed the river. Here the bird settled, strutting over the turf with bright eyes and darting beak, plucking a feast of grubs and grasshoppers from the ground. Gondar beached Stormrunner and Toril followed suit, both captains splashing through the shallows at the head of 20 strong scouting parties. The wolf boats carried 40 men apiece, and those left on board set to securing the vessels, putting out a ring of guards while the others cut inland. Toril was sent seawards to scout the hills to their right, and Gondar, with Raven and Spellbinder close behind, set out to the left-hand range. His plan was simple, to reach the hills and move north towards the pass they could see in the far distance. There, the two groups would join and return to their ships. Unless danger showed, Raven, although born of Ishkarian parents, knew little of the country. Her mother had told her stories of the little coastal village from which she had been taken by the lion slavers, and frightening tales of the beast-men of Ishkar, though Raven had never seen one of those fabled creatures. The land around them appeared too peaceful to contain anything so savage, the gentle roll of the hills shimmering green beneath a warm sun. The air filled with the chirping of insects, the sonorous hum of flying things. That sense of peace was increased by the soft murmuring of the brook crossing the meadow and the tiny birds that fluttered above them, uttering high, fluting cries as they ate on the wing. That idyllic scene was disrupted somewhat by the twin columns of armored men tramping over the grass, swords and axes at the ready, narrowed eyes in constant motion to scan the horizons for danger signs. There was no interruption to their march except from disturbed cicadas. And they covered the 20 cliffs to the hills at a fast pace. Gondar knew that they were in Ishkar without being sure of their exact location. Spellbinder suggested that the river was the boundary line with sly, beastmen and cannibals preferring the heartland of their respective domains and thus leaving the river basin empty. He appeared to be correct, for they reached the hills and turned north without sight of life. The hills, though gentle, continued for many cliffs, so that it was impossible to glimpse the interior of the country until they reached the pass. There the stream bubbled from between two mossy rocks, affording them a welcome source of fresh water. They slaked their thirst in pairs as the sun sank down across the sky, waiting for Toril to join them. Through the pass they could see a rolling savanna that seemed to stretch away into infinity, its tall-grassed flatness of a yellow uniformity that tricked judgment of distance to such an extent that it was impossible to tell whether the plain was 30 cliffs or 300 wide. The sea wolves accepted it as they accepted the ocean. But Raven felt a disturbing unease when she stared over the unbroken vastness. There was nothing to break the view, no villages showed, no smoke, no birds. There was only that great sun-bleached emptiness. She was glad when Toril came up to report a similarly uneventful march and they turned back to the coast. The sun was down before they reached the two wolf boats, mouths watering at the smell of baking fish that drifted on the night breeze. The guard crews had been busy, for the ships were drawn up beyond the waterline. Rollers set to allow a swift launching, and awnings spread to provide shelter should it be needed. Cooking fires glowed and the last of their wine was passed around the groups of resting men as a pale moon rose like a waxen beacon above the now silent meadow. It was a tranquil scene, but for all that, Gondar kept men posted to guard the land and water approaches, and the black bird perched, aloof, atop Stormrunner's masthead, as though confident of their safety. In the morning, after they had breakfasted on more of the succulent river fish, they prepared to leave. 30 men were left behind to guard the wolf boats while Gondar, Toril, Spellbinder, and Raven headed a triple column of the remaining 50 towards the pass. The bird took to the air as the columns formed, flapping low overhead with a raucous cry that seemed to urge haste upon them. Gondar answered the avian command by breaking into a loping run that was the customary pace of the crag reavers. They ran for 3 cliffs, then walked before running again, and in that way reached deep into the savanna before sunset. Hunters were sent out, returning with small animals that bore tiny horns on their mouse-like skulls and proved to be excellent eating. They were spit roasted over fires of the thick grass in a clearing Gondar had ordered stamped down. The grass reached high as a man's waist, and while it was suppliant enough to offer no obstruction, it was sufficiently tall to hide approaching enemies should they choose to crawl through the animal tunnels that warrened the plain. The night, however, passed peacefully enough, though sentries complained of insect bites and one reaver, fairer than most, wore a red-rimmed explosion of swelling punctures come morning. By noon 3 more men bore the same angry aspect, and when they made camp that night 2 were delirious. Their ravings disturbed the others, and at dawn it was obvious they could go on no longer. Gondar selected a party of 5 sea wolves, all suffering from the insects, to escort the stricken men back to the river. It was a minimal depletion of his force that would speed up the rate of march for the others who mostly appeared unaffected by the stings and bites. They continued unhampered for 2 more days before 7 reavers went down into delirium. It was obvious that they could not go on, nor were they fit to make the return journey. Gondar chose 2 protesting men to remain with them, giving instructions that they should nurse the stricken reavers until they recovered or died. Then the others, following the bird, marched north. They marched through the long day, camped, and marched again. Morning brought the same routine, and always the black bird beat the air ahead of them. They saw nothing save the small animals that seemed the sole inhabit, ants of the savannah, and as the sun grew warmer, brighter, the grasslands appeared to float away forever. It was as though they traversed some limbo designed by a malevolent god as a trap for men, drawing them ever onwards through a landscape that was the same each evening as it had been that morn, a treadmill of sameness that rolled eternally above and around them. Until it ended with an abruptness that lost 2 of the reavers. Gondar had put scouts ahead of their path since entering the grass country. Whether bored by the routine or tricked by the deceptive landscape, it was impossible to tell. At one moment, 2 heads showed above the grass, at the next they were gone. The column halted on Gondar's command and he moved slowly forwards, backed by 4 of his men, with Raven and Spellbinder. They clustered together, expecting attack. Instead, they found the end of the savannah. The tall grass went on to the edge of a sheer cliff. Twin trails of crushed stems marking the passage of the scouts. The trails ended in nothingness, the savannah chopped away as though some cosmic shovel had plowed a gigantic trench deep through the heart of Ishkar. For many cliffs, a sheer grey wall fell like a curtain of stone before them, and far below they could see 2 dark shapes, twisted and broken, to mark the scouts' fall. The farther edge of the basin was undiscernible, but across its visible width stretched a luxuriant tangle of jungle. Plumes of smoke rose from amongst the dense foliage and here and there showed the dark holes of clearings. The reason for the savannah's emptiness was obvious. Whatever form of life occupied this part of Ishkar was concentrated within the massive canyon, cut off from the high grasslands by the plummeting walls of naked rock. Raven gasped as she peered out over the edge, for just as the savannah had seemed like a smooth, unending sea, so this great rift was like a green and storm-tossed ocean. "How can we find the skull down there?" she asked. "Even if there were a way down, we should lose ourselves. Remember the bird." Spellbinder touched her shoulder, pointing along the cliff face. "We have a guide still." A half-clee from them, the bird hovered, riding the updraft on lazy wings. Its beak opened as Raven looked towards it, an imperative call summoning them in its direction. When they reached the place they found a cleft in the rock that, on further investigation, revealed a narrow path leading down. Precipitous was that walkway, scarce wide enough for one man to traverse with ease so that the heavy-built seawolves perforce moved cautiously, faces to the cliff, in a shuffling sideways gait. The path, though to call it that was to grant a goat trail a title grander than it deserved, went steeply down the sides at the chasm to a slightly broader span. There, 2 men could stand side by side, which was just as well for the next part of their journey consisted of a vertical descent down a series of hand and footholds covering 5 spear lengths to a second ledge. From there the path continued in the opposite direction, running ever downwards towards a third ledge and a second ladder-like descent. It went on in that fashion all the way down the cliff, as though whoever had carved it out had sought to render entry as difficult as possible. Certainly, the zigzag nature of the trail allied to the vertical sections would enable a single defender to hold the path against any climbers. Equally, a descent would provide bowmen or spear throwers stationed below with an easy target. Such thoughts were in all their minds as they moved warily downwards, though none could say whether the inhabitants of the jungle below had built the path to reach the savannah, or whether some long, disappeared cliff dwellers had carved a way down. It took them until sunset before they felt earth beneath their feet, and had an attack started, they would have fallen easy prey. Raven's legs were strained by the shuffling descent, her arms ached from clutching at the rock, her shoulders and spine protested the burden of armor and weapons. Their camp was quiet, tired men collapsing gratefully into sleep at the foot of the cliff, trusting in the sentries to give warning of any danger. At dawn they found the late watch guards with their throats ripped out. There had been no sound, and when Raven looked around for the bird she found it gone. Spellbinder could offer no explanation, nor could Gondar understand how a jungle beast might kill 3 men without a whisper. The massed ranks of thick-stemmed trees, girded with heavy trailers of vines and exotic flowers, took on a more sinister aspect as they peered into the shadowy darkness. It was as though the jungle itself waited, brooding, to drag them to its bosom, there to render them down into mold that would feed its roots. Raven shuddered as she watched it. Gondar cursed, aiding his remaining men in the construction of a shared cairn, vowing horrible revenge on whatever had killed his sentries. They moved carefully that day, following the first trail they saw leading to the interior. That it was used was obvious from the way the spongy loam of rotting vegetation was crushed flat, winding amongst the lowering trees in a serpentine path that befuddled their sense of direction. The sea-wolves carried their shields high and their weapons drawn, staying close together, as though the undergrowth pressed upon them with tangible force. And, surely, it seemed possessed of a strange, near, sentient life. Where the savannah had been silent save for the stirring of the wind, so that men started at a sudden noise, the jungle was clamorous with inexplicable sound. Tiny rustlings filled the air, as though a myriad unseen creatures scurried through the brush and the branches, high-pitched shrieks echoed above them, the screamers hidden behind a ceiling of interwoven creepers and low-spreading branches that dripped long streamers of greasy moss. Supperous growths of varying hues, all leprous and vile to the eye, great coughing roars accompanied the sound of running feet, of branches and bushes hurled aside in reckless flight that ended with a dying scream and the ominous sound of tearing jaws. Raven found it difficult to tell when the sun went down, for the jungle itself wore a phosphorescence that belied the absence of natural light, outlining vines and stems with a shimmering, deceptive glow of gangrenous corpse color. They halted when they were too tired to go any farther, gathering at the center of the narrow path behind a wall of shields. I was dry enough to burn. It seemed that everything dripped, no fire could be lit, because the jungle offered no fuel. That moisture collapsed into soggy fragments at the merest. They ate their stored meat raw or went hungry, according to their tastes. In the morning, there were 2 more corpses, one man stretched out on the loam a short way from his fellows as though he had sought a separate sleeping place. His rest, however, was eternal, for his ribs gaped wide and bloody, the flesh rent even through his mail shirt. The other stood propped against the trunk he had sought to protect his back. His face was pallid, bloodless, the vines holding him upright, covered with the spillings of his veins. Like the sentries who had died at the cliff, his throat was a gaping wound, thick with flies and crawling things. This time Gondar did not bury his dead. Rather, he set them to one side of the path, using the dank moss to trace the eye of the All-Mother upon their foreheads before starting forwards again. Venting his impotent fury on the vines and branches that hung across his path, Raven, her armor chafing in the dampness and the heat, fell into step beside Spellbinder, noting the brooding expression on his pale face as he stared warily about him. Where is the bird? He shook his head, shrugging. I know not. It comes and goes as it chooses. Are we on the right track? It was difficult to speak, for the very air seemed to fill her mouth with a cloying warmth. Or are we lost? I know not. Again he shrugged. I doubt it, for I've a feeling the bird led us here deliberately, brought us to the one path that will lead us to the skull of Quez, and left us to fend for his elves. And how many more must die before we find it? Her question was largely rhetorical, born of discomfort and unease, the inability to take direct action. Not many, I hope. Spellbinder's voice was bitter, though Raven sensed it was not directed at her. We go where we must. We do what we must. So it goes. He quickened his pace, as though unwilling to continue answering her questions, and Raven let the matter drop, concentrating on the path. It was difficult going, for the way was soft and sticky, the miasma of rotted material carpeting the jungle floor clinging like mud to her boots. Great bloated spiders scuttled before them, and iridescent creatures with too many legs and rattling pincers scurried madly away. She gritted her teeth, fighting down the nauseous loathing that prompted her to turn and hurry back the way they had come. Had she ventured into this rotting green hell alone, she would most likely have followed her natural instinct. Her hatred of Don Wayne and her instinctive trust in the stone and the bird, however, urged her on, those things and a resentment towards whatever had killed the Reavers. So, the silver sword clutched firm in her right hand, she pressed forwards after Spellbinder and Gondar, grinding spiders and ground runners savagely beneath her feet. That night they found a clearing and sufficient dry wood to make a small fire. The sea-wolves were nervous and irritable, and used to so long a journey inland, anxious to come to grips with their unseen enemies, and at dawn their impatience was satisfied, for it was then that the beast men of Ishkar attacked.